Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV. HFO-TV is co-sponsored by the construction, repair, and restoration firm J.R. Johnson, the real estate law firm Baljanik LLP, the tax deferral accommodator Butler Exchange Group, the mortgage banking firm Gantry Incorporated, and Forensic Building Consultants, providing building structural science services.
Welcome back to HFO TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today we've got Dr. Gerard Mildner. He's the director of the Center of Real Estate for Portland State University.
We were talking a little bit about the kind of zones of development within our region. And I think that one of the challenges that we face is when we think about the boundary is where the land is needed is largely on the west side or the southwest side of our metropolitan area, essentially the Tualatin River Valley. And the one major expansion that Metro did about 10 years ago was the Damascus Expansion, and that was largely driven by, of all things, the quality of the dirt in Damascus as compared to the quality of the dirt. It's a lousy place to farm. It's got a lot of hills and rocks. It's got a slightly windier, colder climate than the west side, and so we expanded 20,000 acres in the Damascus area for new development, and yet it was a place where people didn't want to live, and the locals didn't want them there.
Right.
They liked Damascus, the rural place that it always is going to be. So I think that the future for us moving forward is going to be a lot of expansions of 5,000 acres here, 5,000 acres there. Metro, in its infinite wisdom, well, it's really state statute that they're following, will only expand the boundary for residential purposes once every 5 years, or for small expansions, they can do that at an intermediate date. The 4 expansions that we had in 2018, 2019 were Hillsborough, Beaverton, Wilsonville, and King City. And
all pretty much on the west side.
All pretty much on the west side, yeah, and certainly west of the river. Tend to be in these kind of high income corridors. So those were well chosen. It's going to take a while for them to develop. Nobody's laying streets for the developer to sell their lots in. The developer has to come up with a master plan, working with the local jurisdiction to make that happen. Reed's Crossing, for example, and that was from a previous expansion decision. They're apparently paying some $60,000 per housing unit for infrastructure costs. So it sets a real high barrier on trying to get that development. One of the other challenges that we face is that our regional officials are recognizing that housing prices are appreciating very rapidly. If you look at the 20 cities in the Case-Shiller Index, which is a quality-controlled housing price index, if you look at the 20 metropolitan areas that are in that index, we're in the top 6. We're up there in terms of the
appreciation.
Amount of appreciation between year 2000 and the year 2021, and so we're up there with San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, all these really high-priced communities, and so it's a challenge for us. And I think, unfortunately, the problem is that these prices that we're reaching in our metro area, I mean, we appreciated, depending upon which index you look at, either 12 to 15% in the last year.
On single family.
On single family housing, right? That we're going to be steering our children to move to these other regions, the places that are more accommodating for growth, places like Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, Tampa, Charlotte. Those kind of areas that are going to be much more accommodating to growth are going to be much more attractive ultimately for firms to set up their business, because they don't have to pay a premium wage to their workers to afford the local housing stock.
So do you see, are you sensing in terms of, you're political in terms of your Portland State, the major university in the city of Portland, so you're dealing with Metro, Multnomah County, and Clackamas County in the city of Portland. Do you think there's an understanding about what some of the legislation that's been put in place has affected on the cost side, or is it there's an article in the Oregonian or something about the appreciation, and all they talked about was the money that's coming up and people, paying all cash. There was no kind of connection to, well, if you had more supply, maybe that wouldn't be the case. Do you get a sense that that message is getting through, or are we still kind of?
I still think that we're at the end of the beginning.
Okay.
And what I've tried to do in my kind of public engagement is to kind of focus on the real estate community, make sure that, and the business community, make sure that they're aware of what these trade-offs are,
Right.
so that when we meet with public officials who have power over these issues, we at least have some sensible claims to make. But I do not. I think there has been some help or some good thinking and certainly a lot of goodwill within the legislature. I think the Speaker of the House, Tina Kotek, has been trying to tackle the housing supply issue by the so-called reform of single-family zoning.
From a zoning standpoint. Yes.
From a neighborhood zoning point of view, there's a recognition by Speaker Kotek and others in her caucus that exclusive single-family zoning, which is kind of pretty common within the United States, is a serious constraint on development. You can look at places like the East Bay of Oakland. I always remember recall taking the BART in from Oakland Airport down to San Francisco and being shocked that in a community where the average home price is $1 million, that I'm surrounded by high-rises all over the East Bay. And the reason for that is that these communities have largely made apartment construction illegal. Two-story houses, that's fine. Maybe a small garden apartment here or there, but nothing that would be nothing of the scale that would be justified by the overall level of home prices. So this is a trend within urban planning. It meshes well with their critique, for example, of redlining that the government implemented in the 1930s and 40s. And so we've seen this allowance for property owners who have a large lot to develop them for duplexes or triplexes or quads or cottage clusters. That was approved in Minneapolis. It was approved in Portland. Right. It was proposed in the California state legislature but defeated, but maybe that'll come back. That would be wonderful if that were true. But I think for the challenge for a community like ours is twofold. One is that these decisions to put a granny flat in my backyard or to take my large lot and put maybe in a house or an extra house is really a serious lifestyle change for most homeowners and is not easily going to be taken up. So the scale of the issue is a problem that you're being developing housing by onesies and twosies.
It's not going to move the needle. I mean,
it's not going to move.
Right.
It's not going to move the needle. And then, perhaps more importantly, large parts of our metro area are governed by private zoning, CC&Rs, and most of those private zoning agreements will not allow for people to be putting in granny flats or duplexes. And the legislature knew this, and they made it so that you couldn't put in new private zoning covenants in the future.
But didn't address the ones that were already in place.
Yeah, so I live in an area near Homewood in Raleigh Hills and near Montclair in Raleigh Hills. These are communities with $700,000 to $1 million homes, but we're not going to see, and so therefore they have the market potential to have a lot of new housing being built, but the zoning in place is just not going to let it happen. And so, frankly, whether you want to go to the political turmoil of trying to get those people to accept denser housing, I think is highly questionable. So I think again a new kind of I think some of the spirit is willing, but the mind needs to reformulate what's feasible.
Right. So let's in our world in the multifamily side, we've had a host of different legislation from doing the rent, first state to do kind of statewide rent caps. We've got, there's the inclusionary zoning that was put in place, back in, I think it was 15, and, everything 2017 and beyond above 19 units had to include, an affordable component. We told the city in doing that, you're going to see, lots that maybe could hold more housing. That instead of building a 30, they're going to build a 19 to stay under that. It's not going to produce the amount of affordable housing that they penciled. It would be better to do a carrot, so to speak. Hey, if you put this in, maybe you get added density or something like that. I mean, maybe shine some light on terms of on the multifamily side.
Sure.
Because there really seems to be a disconnect in terms of housing providers. I've used the term weaponized, kind of that relationship between housing providers and tenants, and which it doesn't benefit anybody. And we're starting to kind of feel that from a development. Like if I've got development dollars or equity dollars, I can pick markets to go to. Am I going to come to Portland? Again, this is down the stream. You may not feel that effect for a couple of years, but there's going to be an issue.
I think the rent control measure that was put in place is just simply bad advertising. No landlord in town is going to want to raise their rents by 10%, in certainly in this market environment. Although it does kind of truncate your possible returns if you dropped rents for a while and then rose them back up to market levels. So I think what that will tend to do is that it will tend to lawyer up every landlord in town to be very cautious about any kind of rent discounts that they would ever offer. I think the bigger issue, and frankly, Oregon doesn't deserve to be on the same list as New York, New Jersey, and California. Those are really high cost places, and we just don't have the same constraints that those places do. I think the bigger issue of the ones you've mentioned is the inclusionary zoning. And that was requested by a lot of the housing advocates within the region, and lobbied for by the City of Portland Planning Bureau.
Yes.
And so they had to lobby the state legislature to empower them to do that. Previously, there had been regulations preventing towns from doing that.
Yeah, Salem had to change it before City of Portland could enact it.
That's right. That's right. So, of all the jurisdictions within the state, City of Portland was the only one who took it up. They quite sensibly grandfathered in any existing projects with a February 1 deadline. So suddenly everybody who had a serious development site scrambled to put a proposal together so that they were at least able to claim that grandfathering status. And we lived for about 2 years on those kind of developments that were grandfathered in without the regulation in place. There had been, in the years leading up to that, a lot of pent-up demand for downtown living. The recession that we experienced in 2008 and 2009 caused a lot of young adults, a lot of my students, for example, to delay marriage, to delay family formation. And if you're young and single, you don't really want to live in a picket fence suburb. You want to live where the bars and the music venues are.
So we had a pent-up demand coming out of 2010 in terms of construction, and we weren't, I always tell people lenders were slower to get back into it. So you had smaller developers not able to get construction financing. So we had 10, 11. If you looked at the numbers, there should have been more development than we saw on the multifamily side. Then when they enacted the inclusionary zoning, you saw additional, as you said, developers running in, let me get my plans pre-approved. So we had this kind of, I want to say, unnatural kind of kick up on supply. But we're now starting to see the effects, because if you're looking in the future, supply permits have gone down. A couple, we've got construction costs up. I mean, I'm always curious, we've seen, hey, we have created some new housing, but some affordable, but I'm hoping there's maybe a recognizing, they're recognizing that, hey, maybe that wasn't great policy. Maybe we need to change. I mean, what's your take on that?
I think the problem is that you have to tell them an economic story. And
we know how that goes.
Well, it's both theoretically challenging, but also there's a time delay between the policy in place and the effect for what it happens. And so I think the longer terms, so the comparisons that I make are between 1990 and 2007 and 2010 up to 2019. And when you look at the number of permits within our 4-county region, they're down about 15%. And that's not healthy, because the population as a region has grown much more, so we should be generating even more permits per year than we did in the past. And what happened in that shift was a major decline in the amount of single-family permits, particularly in suburbs. So we saw a 30% decline in Clackamas County and 40% decline in permits in Washington County overall, not just single-family, just overall
permits.
Overall permits within these two major counties within our metro area, and Multnomah County and the City of Portland kind of backfill that because of all of this ability to put in new apartments, as well as the grandfathered units from 2017. Now that those grandfathered units have basically been burnt off, we've kind of burned off that supply, the permits within Multnomah County have collapsed. So, we're down about 25% in terms of the permits that are available, or the permits that have been issued across the entire region, largely because of the problems that are happening in Multnomah County. So I think there needs to be a political re-education, both amongst the industry and to the extent that you can, the general public, but also amongst the folks who are writing the laws and writing the ordinances that govern our region.
And in terms of, in looking, I always tell, it's always tough when you start talking about added density, bringing density in, and you've got Portland has I think last time I saw it was 60% is single-family homes within the region, within the city. Trying to get that kind of, talking to somebody who owns a home, this is the benefits of density. If you don't have it, where are your kids going to live, or where your grandkids going to live? Are they going to be able to afford in this city if you don't kind of keep up? It's been interesting to try to get that get that message across. I think on the political side, everything is done under the lens of it's all got to be affordable. You try to talk to them about naturally affordable, and the length is so long. Kind of, we talked about this before in rent control. I mean, you can do rent control. There's no appropriations. The unintended consequences don't happen for a while. By the time they do, the people that put it in place are probably somewhere else. You kind of get that feeling on this with talking about kind of a long-term plan. My hope is that politically maybe there's a shift that we start seeing. Maybe a wider spectrum of how they're looking at it, not so kind of in this lane of what's happening today, what's the downstream issue.
I mean, our population growth numbers have not really changed that much.
Right. And
people who move to this region are first and foremost from California and secondarily from Washington State. So I think and they come with a lot of baggage from what they've experienced in those places, and frankly, from their point of view, housing costs in Portland might actually seem somewhat low, and they come in with a fair amounts of equity. So the question really becomes, of the thousands of Californians that move to our region, do we allow them to be able to buy the kind of large homes that they're looking for and that they can afford on the suburban fringe, or if we don't, are we prepared to accept the fact that they're going to bid up the price of housing that's already here in the first place? And we've chosen the latter, but clearly we'd be much better off, if they were able to buy new housing. I think the other challenge that we face with new housing is what you alluded to, which is that housing depreciates over time, right? Housing, unless you make major improvements in it, loses about 1% to 2% of value each year, and that shows up in cracked sidewalks. It shows up in peeling paint. It shows up in decks that get a little bit faded and old. It shows up in mossy roofs. You can't build a house with a mossy roof. It takes time to get these kind of benefits. Right. And so as housing depreciates, it offers less housing service, and therefore becomes more affordable. So, just in the same way, if you were trying to find an affordable refrigerator, you'd go on Craigslist, or if you're looking for an affordable automobile, you'd go to 82nd Street. If you're looking for affordable housing, you're going to look for housing that was built 30, 40 years ago. And if we're not building new stuff to soak up the demand of the new residents who do come in with a fair amounts of income and wealth, then we're not going to see the houses filter down. They're going to basically take
the cost of everything's going to go up.
Yeah. They're going to take the old housing that's out there, gussy it up, and that housing no longer becomes available for the middle class. And so I think this is a real challenge for our region. It's going to take a new kind of politics.
Do you see a recognition of that? I mean, when you're talking to policymakers, do you see a recognition of, some of the policies that have been put in place? What's that done to, in terms of, we talked about the system development charges for developers?
It's grudging. It's grudging.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a number of conversations with Ted Wheeler, asking him, when is your review of inclusionary zoning happening? And so, we've got a team. They're working on it.
Right.
We're waiting for the report to come down. So they're looking. I would say they're looking for political cover. They're looking for some information that they can use to kind of recognize reality. But it is hard. It is hard to sell people on the idea that we should allow for new housing and not force new housing to have a subsidized component or a below market rate component to it. New housing by its nature is kind of ugly. The first thing you were going to want to do as a developer of new housing is to have a blank slate. Let the new home buyer decide if they want birch trees or dogwood trees or Douglas fir trees in their backyard. It grows in and it becomes like many of the neighborhoods. I mean, even some of our leafiest communities in Portland, like Irvington and Alameda, initially started out as new housing developments. And so I think it takes a little bit of imagination, a little bit of re-education. I think that the real estate community has kind of woken up to this issue. Right. They're seeing regulation happening on
all kinds of fronts.
On all sorts of fronts. You want to lease a new unit? Well, these are the rules for you to lease a new unit.
Right.
You've got somebody not paying rent. Well, let's find out the reasons. Let's give them some time in order to pay rent. Oh, you're gonna raise rent to the level that they need to move out. Well, you need to provide some moving expenses for these people. I mean, in what industry in the country do we require somebody who stops selling to or stops buying from that shop to suddenly get compensated so that they can go shop someplace else? That makes absolutely no sense, and ultimately is going to be a burden on landlords. So I think.
Well, I think it's already there. I mean, from our standpoint, it's already there. I tell people we're the only industry where added supply. You're penalizing the people who are bringing supply to the service for bringing supply or providing supply. I mean, you're not doing that in the food industry. You're not having people walk into a grocery store and say, thanks, I'll take these. Oh, by the way, I'm not paying and see you later. I mean, we're the only industry that has the burden of providing the service is provided. And we've talked, to various people and said, if you really wanted to make a solution, it'd be better to get vouchers to tenants or something like this, but you continue to penalize or have the property owners feel that burden or hold that. At some point, that's going to break. Because we already starting to see. I mean, we've got people that are getting out or saying, I can't, I don't want to be a property owner anymore. I'm going to sell. Well, now it's another unit that's outside of the, rental pool, which again then drives up costs again. And it's just kind of this circle that we hopefully can get some maybe better policy on how to handle this.
And we may need to think outside the box in terms of how we respond to some of these public pressures, right? We've had a lot of demands in our region, for example, for improved equity and repairing some of the challenges that African Americans and other immigrants have faced over the years. And so there is kind of there is a need for repairing some of our social fabric and for creating new opportunities. For example, I think we should be in favor as an industry for slightly increases in our property tax assessments beyond the 3% that were guaranteed by Measure 5, because what that would do is that would give these local jurisdictions the resources that they need in order to put in the sidewalks and repair the unpaved streets and put in the arterials that we desperately need. Because if we don't, what we're turning to on the flip side are basically a lot of soak the rich and soak the corporations kind of spending proposals. Right. When you look at, for example, at the transportation bond, equity within transportation finance generally means you come up with a gasoline tax or some kind of excise tax to pay for the infrastructure needs that are used by those users. Instead, Metro, because they were fixated on this inequality issue, went for a soak the corporation, soak the rich kind of funding mechanism, which had no connection whatsoever to the infrastructure that was being developed. So I think we need, more robust communities, and unfortunately, I think that may mean more annexations by our municipalities. I mean, again, to use the example of the transportation bond, where so much of it was being used for neighborhood improvements, and the county I live in, Washington County, is full of really large unincorporated areas like Aloha and Bethany, for example, are all unincorporated. They may have some very substantial infrastructure needs, but they're outside of a city jurisdiction, so the people save a few $100s a year,
Right.
but they don't get the sidewalks they seem to be asking for. So I think we need to think more carefully about bread and butter improvements. Mark Haas was a big supporter of trying to have property tax reform as a state senator. He's unfortunately out of the state senate. Maybe he'll come back. We'll see. But I think we need to, again, think outside the box, think about what people's real needs are, because ultimately, we're in the industry of providing housing to people. And if you look at low-income households, they spend 40–50% of their income on housing. So anything that we're doing to put barriers to housing construction, by definition, is anti-poor.
Exactly.
And so we should be in favor of robust housing production, ultimately leading to lower housing costs and lower rents, which in turn will accrue greater benefits to low-income households.
But it feels like the industry is the only one that bring this up. You've got tenant groups, you have politicians that, again, they all go to the supply side and not really addressing they go to the demand side. How do we fix the demand? And we're capping things and not really addressing the supply side, which will, again, there's such an imbalance. We need to get this more balanced.
That's why I think we're at the end of the beginning, because I think we've got to do the next steps. And I would encourage folks who are in the industry, which I think is probably a good part of the audience for HFO-TV, is to think about who your people are, right? Are your people in CCIM? Are they in Columbia Corridor Association? Are they in NAIOP? Are they in Multifamily Northwest? Find who your group is that you affiliate with, that speaks to your interests, and then once you're inside those groups, take some time to join a public affairs committee, transportation committee, a zoning and land use committee, so that you understand these issues, and then within your organization, try to work together so that we can have a unified presentation, so we can have a day at the Capitol. I mean, we might actually meet our legislators in person once COVID is over.
Right.
I mean, we can dream about these things. I shook hands the other day with somebody in church. It was the first handshake I'd given in a year. So I think we need to relearn a lot of our personal communications and apply all of those lessons that we learn, in sales and in kind of business to business kind of relationships, and make it so that we know who our local officials are. I've gone to many audiences within the region, and I love to ask the question, do you know who your metro councilor is? And you literally will get 10%, maybe 5% of the people in the audience. And these are lonely people. They'd love to hear from you. They'd love to have some advice. But if you don't know who they are, and they obviously don't know who you are.
Right. Well, thank you for taking the time to kind of give us some insight there. We'll see you again on HFO-TV. Thank you again.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.